Chapter 1. On the Record. My name is Mara Lindquist. I am a registered polysomnographic technologist, RPSGT certified, with 8 years of clinical practice. For the last 4 of those years, I have been the senior overnight monitoring technician at the Caldwell Sleep Research Center, which is a private research facility contracted to the Harmon Weiss University Medical Campus in, well, I'll leave the city out of it. The review panel knows where they work. I want to be precise about what this recording is and what it isn't. This is not a complaint filed in anger. I passed anger about 6 weeks ago. I am not recording this to be believed. I have been in this field long enough to know what happens to documentation that contradicts institutional interest. It gets reclassified, misfiled, or simply sat on by a committee that meets quarterly and issues findings nobody reads. I have watched it happen to other people's work. I know the shape of it. I am making this record because it is the correct procedural response to what I have observed, and because my training makes procedure feel like the only solid thing left, and because, and I want to be honest about this, I have recently developed some uncertainty about my own memory, and I want a version of events that was recorded while I still trust it. So, I am going to tell you what happened during the Caldwell Center's Sleep Architecture Continuity Study, Cohort Cycle 7. Which ran from February through October of the year in question. I am going to tell you what I found in the records, what I found in the building, and what I found in myself. I am going to tell you about the extra stage. And then this recording is going to go into the same intake system as every other formal concern filed with the Harmon Weiss Ethics Review Panel. The intake coordinator there is a woman named Dana Collis. By the time I get to Chapter 8 of this account, you will understand why I am telling you her name. Pause. I will do this in order, because order is what I have. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Sleep, ****. Most people think sleep is simple. They think it's just the difference between eyes open and eyes closed, between thinking and not thinking, between here and gone. That's not sleep. That's just the door. Sleep is a structure. It has rooms. The first room is light and provisional, and one hypnagogic, the place where you're still half assembled as a person, and a loud noise could pull you all the way back. The second room is more committed, N2, where your brain begins its consolidation work, where memory sorts itself into drawers, where the day starts becoming the past. The third room, N3, deep sleep, slow wave is the loudest silence I know how to measure. The brain produces delta waves, long, slow, rolling, almost geological. A person in deep N3 sleep is profoundly absent from the surface of themselves. And then there is REM, which most people think of as the dream stage, which is a simplification I have mostly given up arguing with. Sleep cycles through these rooms in roughly 90-minute intervals. A healthy adult will complete 4 or 5 full cycles in a night. The architecture is individual but patterned. After 8 years, I can look at a hypnogram, a graph of a full night's sleep broken down by stage, and read it the way some people read a face. At the Caldwell Center, we ran full polysomnography, EEG, EOG, EMG, respiratory monitoring, pulse oximetry, and leg movement sensors. 19 leads on a fully instrumented subject. The data comes in through 2 parallel systems, a digital acquisition platform that runs to a server and produces a clean visual display on my monitoring console, and a legacy analog system that scores directly onto a continuous paper chart using physical stili, the kind of electromechanical setup that was standard practice in clinical sleep labs in the 1980s, and that most facilities have long since decommissioned. Caldwell kept both running. I was told during my onboarding that this was an institutional preference for redundancy. I accepted that explanation. It is a reasonable explanation. The monitoring booth at Caldwell is a sealed room, approximately 12 feet by 14, connected to the subject bedroom by an observation window and an intercom. The booth contains the main console, the analog cart with its paper roll and stylus array, a desk, a chair, that I eventually replaced with my own from home, because the institutional one was destroying my lower back, and a wall-mounted clock that runs 4 minutes fast, and that I have never corrected because, after 4 years, I have simply incorporated the discrepancy into how I read time. The recycled air in the booth has a particular quality after the first 2 hours of a closed shift, faintly mineral, like the building is breathing its own history. It's not unpleasant. I stopped noticing it after the first month. The way you stop noticing the particular silence of your own house at 2 a.m. I work overnight, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Most subjects arrive by 9 for prep and are in bed by 10:30. My son Felix is 9 years old, and his father and I have had a custody arrangement since his 3rd birthday, which means Felix is with me Sunday through Wednesday. I work Thursday, Friday, and Saturday nights. My mother keeps Felix when my shift overlaps with school morning. This is the logistical skeleton my life is built on, and I mention it because the Caldwell position pays significantly more than the hospital polysomnography job I held before it, and that differential is what kept me accepting explanations I should have examined. The dual system discrepancy was documented in my onboarding materials as a known calibration phenomenon, specifically on some subjects. The analog chart would show a brief signal pattern between the end of the final REM episode and the subject's natural waking that the digital system did not capture. The digital system showed a flat line, the characteristic low amplitude, mixed frequency pattern of pre-waking consciousness. The analog showed something else, a pattern of activity that didn't have a name on any legend I had ever been taught to read. It was explained to me as a drift artifact, calibration, inconsistency in legacy equipment. I believed this for 4 years. I believed it, and I logged it, and I filed the timestamps, and I watched it happen. And every single morning I wrote analog artifact, probable calibration drift in the margin of the paper chart in red pen. And the subjects woke up refreshed and went home. And I drove to pick up Felix, and that was the architecture of my life. Until GH's third night. Chapter 3. GH's third night. The subjects in cohort cycle 7 were enrolled for a 5-night study protocol. Tuesday through Saturday, returning the following week for a follow-up clinical interview and a cortisol panel. 19 subjects total. Their identifiers and my monitoring notes were alphabetical initials. Institutional protocol, not my choice. GH was a 58-year-old retired postal worker, quiet and cooperative, with the kind of easy physical stillness during setup that usually indicates someone who has done this before, or who simply trusts people with equipment more than is probably warranted. His first 2 nights were unremarkable. Clean hypnograms for complete cycles on night 1, 4.5 on night 2. Analog drift artifact at the standard timestamp, about 4 minutes, which was within the range I'd seen across dozens of subjects. His self-reported sleep quality scores were good, 81, 83. He said on night 2 that he hadn't slept this well in years. I wrote it in my session notes. I smiled at him through the intercom. Night 3, something was different before I could quantify why. I ran my impedance checks at 10:50 p.m., all 19 leads, clean contacts, good skin prep. The tech who did the setup had done it correctly. GH was lying in the darkened room, looking at the ceiling with an expression of mild contentment, the kind of face people make when they are in a place that has been made quiet specifically for them. I told him to call out if anything felt uncomfortable. He said he'd be fine. He was right in the sense that nothing external happened to him. He went through N1 at 11-20-2, N2 at 11-30-9. His first N3 episode began at 11:54 and lasted 26 minutes, which is on the longer end of normal for his age. His first REM episode ran from 12:41 to 1:09, standard architecture. I annotated the paper chart at each transition, red pen in the margin, stage onset, duration, and any artifacts. The second cycle ran similarly. I did my 1 a.m. visual check through the observation window, standard, and GH was lying on his left side, still, in the particular way that deep into sleep produces, not the looseness of light sleep, a settled, committed stillness. My 3 a.m. visual I skipped. I was reviewing the archive data on my laptop. I had pulled the records from the previous 4 cohort cycles, and was running a count of how frequently the drift artifact appeared, by subject, by night number. It was a project I had started for no reason I could clearly name, a kind of itch I'd been scratching at for 2 weeks. I told myself it was professional curiosity. It may have been something else. Either way, at 3 a.m., I was looking at my laptop instead of through the observation window. At 3:17 a.m., the analog stylus changed. Not in the way it changes for movement artifact. That's a sharp spike, A disruption, something abrupt. This was a transition. The paper chart shows the final REM episode ending at 3:14. The characteristic sawtooth pattern losing its definition, the signal dropping toward the low-amplitude pre-waking state. And then, instead of the digital system's pre-waking pattern, instead of the flat, steady signature I expected on the analog chart, there was something else. I have looked at the photocopy of that chart segment many times since. I want to be careful about how I describe it, because I am not someone who reaches for impressionistic language when clinical language is available. It was not artifact noise. Artifact noise is irregular, asymmetric, and produced by movement, lead displacement, or electrical interference. This was regular, rhythmic, but not in the way a biological signal is rhythmic, not the driven variability of a beating heart or the slow sweep of a delta wave. It had the quality of something intentional, a pattern that was consistent. In a way, biology is not usually consistent, because biology is always slightly uncertain, always variable, always alive in the sense that it is always adjusting. This was not adjusting, this was repeating. It lasted 11 minutes and 20 seconds. I know the duration because I watched it happen. And I wrote the start and end timestamps in the margin of the chart while it was occurring. I know that I was present and alert because my session log shows entries at 3:17 and 3:28 that match. I have the physical paper. At 3:10:8, the pattern resolved into the standard pre-waking signature. I watched the digital display shift. The system registered the transition from sleep to wake. The expected patterns came up, and everything looked normal. At 3:31 a.m., I finally looked through the observation window. GH was lying on his back. He had been on his left side at 1 a.m. He was now on his back, arms loosely at his sides, in a position that was, and I want to be precise, not a natural sleeping position. Not uncomfortable, not distressed, more like arranged. The kind of supine position someone ends up in when they've been repositioned by another person, who was being careful about it. There was no movement artifact on any channel from the period between 1 a.m. and 3:31 a.m. He had moved or been moved without producing a single signal that registered as motion. He woke naturally at 6:12 a.m. His self-reported sleep quality score was 97. He said it with the quiet certainty of someone reporting a fact they found slightly embarrassing in its completeness. 97, maybe 98. I can't remember the last time. His morning cortisol panel came back at 4.2 nanograms per milliliter. The lowest value in the cohort by a significant margin. A number associated with profoundly low physiological stress. A number that would have been clinically notable if I had been looking for clinical notability. Instead, I logged it, processed the sample, and drove home thinking about the analog chart in the filing drawer. The 11 minutes and 20 seconds, and the fact that GH's arms had been at his sides. Chapter 4. The technician who stayed too long. My position at Caldwell was not advertised as a replacement hire. When I interviewed the research coordinator, described it as an expansion of overnight monitoring capacity for the growing trial cohort. This was technically consistent with what I could verify. The Caldwell Center had added 2 additional subject rooms in the 18 months before I was hired, which would plausibly require additional staff. I found out it was a replacement position 14 months into my tenure, when a subject asked me if I was the technician who had worked with him on a previous trial cycle. I said I didn't believe so. That would have been before my time. He said, "Oh, so they did get someone new. I wonder what happened to the other one." I asked HR. I was told my predecessor, a woman who had held the position for approximately 2 years, had left for personal reasons. I was told this in a tone that communicated the inquiry was welcome to stop there. It did stop there. I had Felix's school supplies to buy and a car that needed new tires. The green composition book was in the booth when I started. It was taped underneath the analog cart console, on the metal shelf beneath the main chassis, in a position that was not visible unless you were crouching low and looking specifically. I found it during my second week when I was cleaning what I thought were dust accumulations under the cart and found the book there instead. I looked at it briefly. It appeared to be equipment notes, handwritten entries with dates, lead identifiers, and readings. Sloppy but systematic. I assumed it was reference material left by the previous technician, and I put it back where I found it. reasoning that if she had wanted it recovered, she would have taken it with her. And if someone else wanted it found, they would have found it already. I did not look at it again for 4 years. I looked at it again the morning after GH's third night. I drove home. I slept badly for 5 hours. I went back at 9 p.m. for the next shift, and I arrived early, and I crouched under the analog cart, and I pulled out the book, and I sat in my chair in the red monitoring light, and I read it. It was more systematic than I had initially assessed. The previous technician, I will call her by her initials, which I will leave out of this record for her privacy, since I believe she is trying to be invisible, and I respect the reasons for that, had kept a running log of subjects exhibiting the analog pattern I had been calling drift artifact. She had a shorthand for it, a small symbol, a dash, the letters ES, a colon, and then a duration, ES for extra stage. She had named it the same way I would have named it, if I'd had the presence of mind to name it at all. She had been tracking it since her 3rd month at Caldwell. The entries were careful and consistent. She noted the subject identifier, the date, the onset time, the duration, and then, in a column on the right side of the page, a self-assessment entry that I initially read as physical notes, but which I eventually understood were notes about herself, how she felt the morning after, her sleep quality, self-reported, her energy, a number she was taking regularly that she abbreviated as her cortisol. She was running her own cortisol panels, tracking her own numbers alongside the subjects. Her court numbers started normal, within the standard range for an overnight shift worker in a moderately demanding clinical position. And then, beginning around month 7 of her tenure, they began to drop, steadily. Not dramatically, not in a way that would necessarily trigger concern, but consistently downward, session after session, week after week. By her final entries, her morning cortisol was in the range I had seen in GH that morning, the range I associated with the best sleep of someone's adult life. Her last entry was dated 5 weeks before I was hired. It ended mid-sentence, not dramatically, not the kind of ending that signals distress or interruption. It ended the way a sentence ends, when the person writing it simply decided to stop. The last line completed was, * they know about the ES events. Reyes used the phrase today, extended latency. I've looked it up, and it doesn't exist. I need to figure out if the panel *, and then nothing. I sat with that for a long time. The stylus was scoring the chart behind me. GH's 4th night was underway, architecture proceeding normally. The soft rhythmic scratch of the system reading a sleeping man. I put the book back under the cart. I wrote the session notes. I watched GH sleep. At 4:08 a.m., the extra stage began. It lasted 14 minutes this time. I wrote the timestamps in the margin. I watched through the observation window the entire 14 minutes. GH did not move. His chest rose and fell at a rate that was slower than sleep respiration, more regular than sleep respiration, in a way that I could not put a clinical label on and therefore could not write in the margins of a chart that other people would read. When it ended, he woke at 6:42, 96 sleep quality, cortisol at 3.9. Chapter 5. What 12 subjects have in common. The analog archive for Caldwell's cohort cycles was stored in a lateral filing cabinet in the monitoring booth paper charts. Filed by cycle number and subject identifier, going back to the facility's opening. Each chart roll was cut, folded, and placed in a labeled envelope. They filled approximately 2 drawers. I reviewed the full Cycle 7 archive over 3 consecutive sessions of unauthorized after-shift work. I stayed 2 to 3 hours past my shift end, working at the analog cart under the red monitoring light, running through envelopes. I told my mother I was covering for a colleague. She stayed with Felix. I don't like that I lied to her, but I want to be honest that I did. In cohort cycle 7, 19 subjects, the ES event, the extra stage, that unnamed analog pattern the digital system failed to capture, appeared in 12 of the 19 subjects' charts, never on the first night, always between night 2 and night 5, always between the final REM episode and natural waking. Durations ranging from 4 minutes, 3 seconds. In the case of a subject I'll call RV, to 22 minutes. In the case of a subject I'll call PD. The correlation between ES duration and self-reported sleep quality was essentially perfect. The longer the extra stage, the higher the morning score. GH, at 14 minutes on night 4, scored 96 PD. The longest event in the cohort, scored 99. She told me it was like being brand new. She said it the way people say things they find slightly difficult to believe about themselves. 3 of the 12 had returned to Caldwell between their study week and their scheduled follow-up appointment. Not for clinical reasons, they had called the research line, not the medical line, and left messages asking whether the study team had any information about a phenomenon they were each trying to describe. They used different words. RV said GUPS. PD said missing patches. The third, a man I'll call HT, said blanks. Brief, complete absences from waking consciousness. 3 to 7 minutes. By their reports, no warning, no transition, just before and after with nothing in between. The follow-up clinical interviews, according to the digital record, noted normal sleep consolidation, adjustment period, and expected post-study habituation. No follow-up was scheduled for the symptoms specifically. I cross-referenced the enrollment forms. All 12 subjects with ES events had been recruited through a secondary enrollment channel I had not previously examined closely. The standard cohort was drawn from the Harmon Weiss General Volunteer Research Pool, hospital mailing list, posted flyers, and a small referral network from the sleep medicine clinic. Routine. The 12 were flagged in the enrollment database with a secondary source code I didn't recognize, MCG. I ran the code through the facility's administrative system. It resolved to an organization named Meridian Continuity Group, listed as a community research outreach partner. I searched for the Meridian Continuity Group. Their website was minimal, a contact form, a mission statement that used words like longitudinal wellness and adaptive resilience research without any specifics, and a physical address that resolved, on mapping software, to a mailbox center in a strip mall. No staff names, no affiliated institutions listed, no publication history. The remaining 7 subjects in the cohort, the ones without ES events, had all been enrolled through the standard hospital volunteer pool. I sat with that for longer than I sat with anything else I found during those 3 after-shift sessions, because the implication was not subtle. The 12 subjects who exhibited the extra stage had not been randomly selected by the usual methods. Someone had chosen them, and then enrolled them in a sleep study where the thing that was apparently being looked for was something the study's own documentation refused to name. I drove home at 10:15 in the morning. Felix was at school. My mother had left coffee in the pot. I sat at my kitchen table and drank it, and thought about the previous technician's composition book, and the phrase asterisk, extended latency, consolidation asterisk, which Dr. Reyes had used to me once. 6 months earlier, in a brief conversation, I had mostly forgotten. I had not forgotten it entirely. That's what I realized, sitting at my kitchen table. I had filed it away as institutional jargon I didn't need to interrogate, but I could retrieve it now because it had struck me slightly wrong at the time. And things that strike me slightly wrong tend to stay. I called Dr. Reyes's office line and left a message asking if she had time for a calibration consultation that week. That was the framing I used deliberately. Calibration, neutral, technical, not asterisk. I have been reviewing the unauthorized archive for 3 sessions, and I think your study subjects are being used for something that isn't in the protocol documents. Asterisk. She called back within 20 minutes. She always called back within 20 minutes. I had observed this across 4 years and found it professionally impressive. I found it differently impressive now. Chapter 6. Dr. Reyes knows the word. We met in her office on a Tuesday afternoon. It is a comfortable office, bookshelves with journals and a few personal objects, a desk positioned to face the door, and a window with a partial view of the parking structure. Dr. Reyes is a precise and careful person. She wears the same 3 or 4 professional outfits in rotation. She speaks in complete sentences, and she has never in 4 years made a commitment she didn't keep. I respected her. I want to be clear about that, because I think the distinction matters. What she did and what she is are not the same thing. And I think she is someone who has made a series of accommodations. She did not initially intend to make it, and is now too far in to recover the map of how she got there. This is not the same as malice. It is, in some ways, worse. I showed her the printout of the enrollment database with the MCGR source codes highlighted. I did not mention the composition book. I framed it as a calibration inquiry. I had been reviewing the cohort's physiological data for patterns in the analog system's artifact readings, and I had noticed that the artifact occurred specifically in the McGear-enrolled subjects, and I was wondering if there was a population characteristic that might explain the equipment discrepancy. She listened to this carefully. She did not look at the printout the way a person looks at something they are seeing for the first time. She looked at it the way a person looks at something they have been waiting to be asked about. She said, "What you're observing in the analog data is consistent with what we classify internally as extended latency consolidation. It's a documented but unclassified phenomenon in sleep architecture research. The trial protocol includes passive observation of subjects who present with it," I said. "I've searched the literature. I can't find that term in any published source." She said, "It's pre-publication classification. The research is ongoing." I said, "The MCGR subjects were specifically selected for enrollment. That's not standard volunteer recruitment." She said, "Caldwell has several community outreach partners who identify potential candidates for specialized research tracks. It's within our IRB charter." I said, "Does the IRB documentation describe the extended latency consolidation event?" She was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is not the absence of thought. The kind that is management of information. She said, "Mara, you're excellent at what you do. You have been an exceptional technician for 4 years, and I mean that without qualification. What you're seeing in the analog data is above your pay grade, and I say that not as a dismissal but as a factual statement about the research tier this falls under. Log the timestamps, note the durations. Leave the interpretation to the research team." She smiled when she said it. It was a genuine smile. She was not theatrically lying to me. She was managing me the way someone manages a situation they have been told to manage, with real warmth and without pleasure. I thanked her for her time. I went back to the monitoring booth for the evening shift. That evening I spent 2 hours on every sleep medicine database I have institutional access to. PubMed, Embase, the Sleep Research Society's full publication index, and the European Sleep Research Society repository. Extended latency consolidation does not appear in a single published paper, in any database, in any language with an available English translation. It is not a documented but unclassified phenomenon. It is a phrase someone constructed to fit into a conversation with a technician who is asking uncomfortable questions. I wrote this in my session notes that night in a margin notation that I then carefully crossed out and rewrote in the section of the chart I store myself. I have learned, over the course of what I am about to describe, to maintain 2 versions of some notes. I am not proud of this. It was necessary. Chapter 7. The night GH didn't wake up. Night 5 for GH. He was the last of the MCGR cohort to complete the full protocol in that session block. The other 11 had finished their 5 nights in the weeks prior. I had monitored every one of them. Everyone had presented at least 1 ES event. Most had presented 2 or 3 across their 5 nights. And I had logged the durations in red pen in the chart margins and in the composition book I had been maintaining in parallel under the analog cart. GH's final night started clean. He was relaxed at setup, patient with the 19 leads, politely indifferent to the monitoring equipment in the way he always was. A man who had made his peace with being observed. He was in N2 by 11:50, N3 by 12:15. First REM at 1:41. I did every check correctly. 1 a.m. visual, left lateral, committed stillness of deep sleep, appropriate. Impedance checks at midnight. All leads clean. I was focused in a way I had not been on previous nights. I was watching for the ES onset with the specific intention of documenting everything in real time, not reconstructing it afterward. The final REM episode ended at 2:53. I watched the analog chart. I watched the digital display. I held the red pen and waited. At 2:58 the extra stage began. I wrote it in the margin immediately. ES onset 2 hours 58 minutes and 14 seconds, asterisk, and then I watched. The pattern on the analog chart at 2:58 was the same pattern I had seen on GH's previous nights. regular, rhythmic, and non-biological in its consistency. I watched it the way you watch something you have decided to stay with, no matter what it does. At minute 11, something changed. The pattern didn't break, spike, or distort. It changed character. The regularity increased. The amplitudes began stepping upward in increments. Not randomly. The steps were equal. The intervals between steps were equal. It was as if whatever was producing the signal had shifted from maintenance mode to something else. I have a clinical vocabulary for everything a sleeping human brain produces. I did not have a clinical vocabulary for this. I had only the observation, the pen in my hand, and the fact that GH's vitals on the digital display were stable. Heart rate 61, oxygen saturation 97, respiration 11 per minute. He was fine, by every metric the digital system reported. I looked through the observation window. He was lying on his back. He had been on his side at the 1 a.m. check. He had moved again, without triggering a movement artifact. His arms were at his sides. His face was the word I keep reaching for. His asterisk prepared asterisk. Not peaceful, exactly, prepared. At minute 27, I made the first entry in the margin that was not a measured observation. I wrote, asterisk, this is not an artifact. Asterisk. At minute 31, I ran the wake protocol. The wake protocol for a polysomnography study is non-invasive. Verbal stimulus over the room intercom at gradually increasing volume. Beginning with a normal speaking voice and stepping up if there's no response. I started at normal volume. GH. It's 7 a.m. time to start waking up. This was a lie. It was 3:29, but the verbal cue is standardized. No response. I increased the volume twice over 90 seconds. On the third step, at what I can only describe as firm, not alarming, but firm, GH began to surface. The process of his waking was slower than I had observed on previous nights. He came back from wherever he had been in a way that looked effortful, like ascending through something denser than air. His eyes opened, oriented to the ceiling, and then didn't move for 15 seconds. The digital display registered his transition to wakefulness cleanly, in the first 90 seconds of his orientation period, before he had fully assembled himself as a person. He said 3 words in a voice that was not his voice. The voice was GH's larynx, GH's respiratory system, GH's face. But it was slower than GH spoke, lower in register than GH's normal register. And the regional accent that had been present in his voice across 4 sessions, a particular flat vowel quality I associated with the upper Midwest, was absent. He said asterisk, not yet calibrating, asterisk. And then, before full coherence returned, what sounded like a single word, quieter than the others, half-formed, it sounded like a number. I wrote it in the margin. I wasn't certain I had heard it correctly. I transcribed it phonetically as something close to asterisk 17. Asterisk. GH is fully oriented at 3:32. He looked at me through the observation window with normal recognition. He was himself again, the same easy, cooperative man he had been across 5 nights. He said he had slept deeply. He said his back didn't hurt, which it usually did in the mornings. He gave his sleep quality score as 98. I asked him if he remembered anything from the past hour. He said no. He said the last thing he remembered was the end of a dream that had no narrative, just a kind of big open space, very still, and then I was waking him. I processed his final cortisol panel, 3.7 nanograms per milliliter, the lowest value I had recorded for any subject in my 4 years at Caldwell. I sat in the monitoring booth after he left, and I looked at the paper chart, at the 31-minute ES event on night 5, at the stepped amplitude increase in the final 12 minutes, and at the word asterisk 17 asterisk in my handwriting in the margin. I counted the numbered identifiers in the cohort cycle 7 enrollment database. There were 19 subjects in the digital record. I was designated, in Caldwell's staffing system, as a monitoring technician for the cycle. Staff, not a subject, not assigned a subject number. I counted the MCGR cohort specifically. 12 subjects enrolled through Meridian Continuity Group. I thought about the previous technician. I thought about her composition book. I thought about the fact that I had been in the monitoring booth, within 12 feet of the analog equipment. For 4 years of sessions, 60 sessions a year, approximately, 150 hours of active session time per month, roughly. I thought about the mineral smell of the recycled air, and I decided not to think about the number 17 yet. I needed to find the room first. Chapter 8. What the conduit carries. The building schematic for the Caldwell Center is available through the Facilities Management Office on request, as part of standard operational access for clinical staff. I had never requested it before. Nobody had offered it to me. There was no reason, in the normal operation of a monitoring technician's job, to need a floor plan. I requested it on the grounds of a safety audit, and I told them I was preparing for a departmental review. This was not accurate. The facilities coordinator gave me a printed copy without question and went back to her desk, and I stood in the hallway outside her office and looked at it for a long time before I folded it and put it in my bag. The monitoring booth is on the second floor. The subject bedrooms are adjacent. This part of the schematic I knew intimately. I could have drawn it myself. What I could not have drawn was the wiring conduit path for the analog system, which is included in the schematic as a single line labeled legacy signal infrastructure running from the monitoring booth south through the exterior wall, then down, then horizontally along the building's first sublevel. The analog cart's wiring exits the booth through a panel in the south wall. I had known this. I had seen the conduit cover on the wall, a gray rectangular plate, painted over several times. I had assumed it ran to a junction box and terminated. The schematic indicated it did not terminate at any junction box on the second floor. It continued. The conduit terminated, according to the schematic, in a room on the sublevel identified by a label, *environmental monitoring, BO4, *. I had been in the sublevel once, and my second week at Caldwell, for a brief facility orientation tour. The tour guide, the research coordinator at the time, who has since been replaced by someone I know less well, did not take us to BO4. I did not remember BO4 from the tour. Either it was not included in the orientation, or I was not paying close enough attention. I suspect now it was the former. I went down to the sublevel on a Wednesday afternoon, my day off, after dropping Felix at soccer practice, and having approximately 90 minutes before I needed to pick him up. The sublevel corridor is utilitarian concrete block walls, overhead fluorescence, a slight ambient hum from mechanical systems, HVAC equipment rooms, a custodial storage area, and a data closet. I walked the corridor with the schematic and found BO4 at the far end, past the data closet. Against the exterior wall of the building, the door was a standard institutional interior door, steel, painted the same gray as everything else down there. A standard keyed lock set I did not have access to. But there was a gap at the bottom of the door, a full inch of clearance between the door and the floor, and from that gap, extending into the corridor, was the edge of what I recognized immediately as analog EEG paper, chart tape. The distinctive quarter-inch striped paper. The grid lines, the format I had looked at in the monitoring booth for 4 years. It was coming from inside the room, running under the door into the corridor. The loose end was in the corridor. The rest of the roll, however much of it there was inside the room. I crouched down and photographed the visible portion with my phone. I then carefully drew the exposed edge of the tape toward me slowly, not pulling from inside the room, just recovering what was already in the corridor, until I had about 8 inches of chart exposed to look at. The signal on the tape matched the extra stage pattern. Exactly. Not a similar pattern. The same regular stepped, non-biological rhythm. I had watched the analog stylus score in the monitoring booth during GH's 31-minute event, and every other ES event I had documented across 4 years. But the timestamps printed on the chart tape were wrong. The analog system stamps each chart section with a running time code. The time code on the tape in the corridor read dates that predated the current cohort cycle by 11 years. By more than 11 years, the earliest visible timestamp predated my higher date by 8 years. And the system was clearly still scoring, still producing tape. The analog system in the monitoring booth had been receiving this signal for longer than I had worked there. Longer than my predecessor had worked there. The equipment was not the source. The equipment was the receiver. Whatever was producing the extra stage signal was in BO4, or was accessible from BO4. And the monitoring booth's analog rig had been, for over a decade, functioning as a passive listening device for something that operated on the same frequency. I carefully returned the chart tape to its position under the door. I photographed the door, the floor gap, the visible portion of the schematic, and the chart edge. I texted my mother to pick up Felix from soccer. I went home and sat in my kitchen for 3 hours. I should tell you what I was feeling, because I want the record to be complete. I was not in the grip of panic. That surprised me when I took stock of it. I was in the grip of something colder and more durable than panic. The feeling of watching a structure you built your life on reveals that its foundations were poured by someone who knew something you didn't. I thought about the mineral smell in the sealed booth. I thought about the sealed booth specifically. I thought about why a monitoring booth would be built with no exterior window and a recycled air system rather than a fresh intake. I thought about what it means for a room to be sealed when it contains equipment that is receiving a sustained signal from a room 11 years in the making. I thought about what the air in that sealed booth had been carrying. And then I stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it required a conclusion I wasn't ready to reach. And I had a formal ethics complaint to file, and I needed to believe, for a few more days, that the process would do what processes are designed to do. Chapter 9. The review panel already has this. The Harmon Weiss Ethics Review Panel maintains a formal submission portal for clinical staff at all affiliated research facilities. I had never used it in 4 years. I navigated to it on a Thursday evening, drafted my complaint with 3 attachments: the photograph of the chart tape under the BO4 door, a scan of the relevant page from my after-shift session notes, and a screenshot of the MECTRA enrollment coding, and reviewed the submission form. The intake coordinator listed on the form was Dana Collis. The name was formatted in the standard institutional style: last name, first name, role title, extension number. Nothing unusual about its presentation. I recognized it because I had spent a week looking at every document associated with the Meridian Continuity Group, and because Dana Collis's name appeared in the secondary contact field of the enrollment forms for all 12 MCGR subjects in Cohort Cycle 7. Not as a Harmon Weiss employee, as a Meridian Continuity Group contact, listed in the secondary field for each of the 12 subjects, in the section that asked for a community organization liaison name. The same person, the Ethics Review Panel Intake Coordinator, was a Meridian Continuity Group staff member. I sat in that for a while. Then I went back to the monitoring booth. Not for a shift. I went in early, before the evening setup began. I sat in the red light, and I pulled the composition book from under the analog cart, and I turned to the last page. I had read the last completed line weeks ago. I had not read past the incomplete sentence, because the page appeared to end there. The line broke off, and there was nothing below it. And I had registered it as the point where the previous technician had stopped writing and did not come back. What I had not looked at closely enough was the back cover. On the inside back cover, in a different pen than the rest of the book, a thinner point. The ink slightly different in color, as if written at a different time. There was a single entry. Not session notes, not a calibration log, a name, my name, Marilyn, written in her handwriting, with no context, no explanation, and no date next to the name itself. But in the upper right corner of that same inside cover, where the previous technician habitually dated her entries, there was a date. It was dated 3 months before I was hired at Caldwell. I had not applied to Caldwell 3 months before I was hired. I had not yet heard of Caldwell 3 months before I was hired. The position posting was not listed anywhere I could find with a date earlier than 6 weeks before my interview. Someone had written my name in that book 3 months before I knew the facility existed. I sat very still for a long time in the red monitoring light. The analog cart was quiet, no active session. The booth was sealed. The air was recycled. The mineral smell was present, as it always was after the first hour. And then I thought about the number 17. I thought about GH saying it, or not saying it, exactly, but producing it, half formed on the edge of reorientation, in a voice that was not his voice. I thought about the phrase asterisk calibrating asterisk that preceded it. I thought about the word asterisk not yet asterisk. I thought about the fact that the McGear cohort was 12 subjects. The full Caldwell cohort was 19 subjects plus me, listed as staff, not as a subject, not given a subject number. I thought about the previous technician. 2 years of exposure, in the sealed booth, in the recycled air, with the analog equipment running, 19 subjects, plus a previous technician was in the position before me, plus me, 21 total individuals in sustained proximity to the signal. But the enrolled subjects were numbered 1 through 19. If 2 people in the room were not enrolled subjects, but were nonetheless present, consistently, repeatedly, across many sessions, and if the signal was indifferent to the distinction between a wired subject and an unwired observer, then the previous technician would have been number 20, and I would be number 21, calibrating, not 17, 21. I had misheard it, or I had heard correctly, and chosen the number that felt less possible, because 17 placed me as a subject within the formal cohort, and that seemed like the worst answer. But 21 meant something different. 21 meant the count didn't stop at the enrolled subjects. 21 meant the room was the enrollment mechanism. 21 meant I had never needed to be wired in. I did not file the complaint through the HarmonWise portal. I am not stupid. I made this recording instead. Chapter 10. On the record. For the record, I am going to tell you what has happened in the 6 weeks since I found my name in the composition book. I have not resigned from Caldwell. I considered it. I turned it over carefully, looking at it from every angle, trying to determine whether my continued presence was a risk to me, or whether my absence would simply install another person in the monitoring booth and add them to the count. I decided that until I understand the mechanism more completely, the least useful thing I can do is remove myself from the only position from which I can observe it. I have resumed running my own cortisol panels each morning. I have been doing this for 6 weeks. My numbers are consistently in the range I associate with subjects in the final phase of ES exposure. They are, in fact, nearly identical to the numbers the previous technician recorded in her composition book in the months before she stopped writing in it. I am sleeping well. Better than I have since Felix was born. Deeply, completely, with a thoroughness I could almost call pleasant if I didn't understand what it suggests. I wake feeling assembled in a way that I am not accustomed to. I do not experience this as frightening. I experience it as data. I have experienced 4 blank episodes in 6 weeks. Brief, complete, no transition in either direction. I am awake, and then I am awake with a gap in between that I can measure only by looking at a clock. The longest was 6 minutes. I have been keeping a log. What I want to say to the review panel, and I am aware of what the review panel is, and I am aware that Dana Collis's intake system will route this recording to the same people who selected me for this position before I knew the position existed, is this: you do not have to suppress this. I know you know how to suppress documentation. You have been doing it for over a decade. You have the infrastructure for it, the misfiled reports, the closed inquiries, the personal reasons that end tenures quietly, the intake coordinator who makes sure the formal channel leads back to the apparatus itself. I know what you are. I know what the extra stage is, at least in functional terms. It is a state of sleep architecture that your equipment has been cultivating in selected subjects for more than 11 years. Using the analog system as a receiver and the monitoring booth as a sealed delivery environment, and the subjects, including me, including my predecessor, including the 21 individuals in your count, are not quite what we were before it found us. I know that you know I know. What I want you to understand, and this is not a threat, because I am realistic about the reach of a monitoring technician's credibility against a research institution, is that I have made copies of the chart photographs, the enrollment cross-reference, and the composition book entries. The copies are with 3 separate people who do not know each other, and who have instructions about what to do with them under specific circumstances. I am not heroic. I am methodical. These are different. I am going to continue coming to work. I am going to continue running the sessions, annotating the paper charts in red pen, doing my impedance checks, and logging the ES events with exact timestamps. I am going to be the best monitoring technician the Caldwell Center has ever employed, because my competence is what makes me difficult to replace, and being difficult to replace keeps me in the booth, and being in the booth keeps me watching, and watching is the only thing I have left that I am certain is mine. I have one more thing to say, and then I am going to stop recording and file this through a channel that is not the HarmonWise portal. Felix had his annual pediatric physical 3 weeks ago. Standard blood work panel. I requested that his physician add a morning cortisol measure to the panel, on the basis that I had some family history of adrenal regulation I wanted to track. This was not strictly accurate. His pediatrician agreed without concern. Felix's cortisol came back at 4.1 nanograms per milliliter. He has never been inside the Caldwell Center. He has never been in proximity to the analog equipment. He has never been enrolled in any research study. He lives in the same house as me. He sleeps in the room across the hall. I need to understand whether the extra stage is something you carry, whether it is communicable through proximity, whether the thing that GH's voice said, calibrating, means the process ends, or means it is ongoing, whether the blanks I am experiencing are a side effect, a symptom, or a stage. I need to understand whether my son, my 9-year-old son, who asks me every Thursday morning if I'll be home when he gets off the school bus, is number 2002. This is Marilyn Quist, RPSGT. This testimony was recorded in full, in my own voice, on my own equipment, in my own home. The time is 11:47 p.m. Felix is asleep across the hall. I checked, he looked fine. I could not bring myself to watch him long enough to be certain. I filed the recording with 4 people. My mother, who doesn't understand what it contains but knows to keep it. A former colleague at the hospital who specializes in clinical ethics and has standing to escalate. A journalist who covers medical research policy, whom I located through a published investigative piece from 3 years ago. And myself, in an encrypted drive. I went back to work the following Thursday. The analog cart was exactly where I left it. The booth smelled like mineral air. The red monitoring light was on. The new cohort cycle, Cycle 8, had its first session scheduled for that night. The enrollment database showed 17 subjects in the standard pool, and 4 enrolled through MCGR. I ran my impedance checks. I picked up the red pen. I wrote the session date in the upper margin of a fresh chart page. The stylus started. I watched the first subject go under. At 2:19 a.m., the analog pattern shifted. I wrote in the margin, *ES, onset 2:19, duration, ongoing *, and below that, because my handwriting is my own, and the paper is physical, and nobody is watching the paper. Felix's number, if he has one, is something I will find out before they do. 3 nights later, I woke at 2:47 a.m. The clock on the booth wall's exact time, 4 minutes fast, and I was not in the booth. I was in my bed, and the mineral smell was there. The specific mineral smell of recycled air from a room with no exterior window, filling my bedroom, filling my son's bedroom across the hall, and when I got up to check the hallway, there was nothing there. Just the smell. Just the dark. Just the quiet that I now understood was not the absence of something happening, but the presence of something that had learned not to make noise.